Usually how I like to start these conversations is really about an individual's journey. And you're working on something pretty amazing, pretty new, pretty innovative. But let's start with how you got there. What happened before you started Moss?
Well, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be talking here with you, Grant. I never really did anything or had anything to do with environmentalism, but born in Rio, raised in Sao Paulo, which are the two biggest cities in Brazil and some of the biggest in the world. But half of my family lives way deep in the jungle in Brazil, not in the Amazon forest, but in a swampy sort of Everglade area south of the Amazon, which is called Pantanal, which very few people know, but it has all the exotic fauna and biodiversity. It's sort of like being in the middle of the forest. No, not sort of. It is like being in the middle of the forest. And that's where I spend all my vacations, my summers, etc. And this is how I got to be connected with just with the environment and to care about it. I went to school in the States. I went to boarding school near Boston. Then I went to Stanford, and then I came back to Brazil and worked for 18 years in traditional finance. Investment banking. Then I was working for a hedge fund, New York hedge fund, and then I set up my own fund that invested in the largest Latin American companies. Companies from Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Peru, etc., for Canadian and U.S. endowments and pension funds. So my career really had nothing to do with it, but I did have this family connection and, well, three connections. One, through my family that lived in the forest, literally. Two, through my first wife. I married for the second time. My first wife was an analyst. She was one of the first ESG analysts in the world, probably.
Wow.
Definitely in Brazil. Looking beyond the bottom line, the financial bottom line, and trying to incorporate a more holistic approach to investment. This began in Europe in 2003 through the PRI, which is the Principle for Responsible Investments. At the time, it was a novel idea, to look beyond. She sort of brought this to Brazil, and I got to learn a lot about why one should look at in terms of environmental standards when investing. Okay, because the thesis is if companies look only at the bottom line, it'll lead to eventually excessive risk taking. Eventually the shareholder might have a loss because the company dumped whatever oil in the ocean or something like that, right? So to avoid those losses in the long term, by doing the sort of analysis, you avoid these big losses and you get better risk adjusted returns. And she did this, so I learned about it, and I applied a lot of that in my fund when I was investing. I was managing my own fund. And I think the third connection is my aunt she's passed away, but was very well connected politically in Brazil, and she was connected with the guys who founded the Green Party in Brazil. So those three sort of paths made me always be very interested in environmentalism. I was as a kid, instead of being a fan of Michael Jordan or Pele or Michael Jackson, I was a fan of Jacques Cousteau, the explorer, and a bunch of environmentalists in Brazil. So, and the moment of truth or existential crisis that made me, leave the quote unquote dark side of finance to work with environmentalism was 2 years ago when my daughter was born. It was a time when the new government that is now in power in Brazil, it was the first year for this government, and the deforestation in the Amazon went rampant. I mean, it literally doubled, the rate on a year-on-year basis. And for me, it becomes always, whatever happens there becomes very real because my family tells me, look, they're burning everything on over here, and it's getting really dramatic. It's not something that I just read on the papers, right?
Hmm.
Or read on. And I started thinking, look, a bunch of things. When you have, do you have kids?
I do not have kids. No, no. I have a nephew, so he's like my
People always told me when you have a kid, your perspective on things
sure.
changes. And I always thought, that's bullshit.
Right.
Whatever. I'm not gonna change that much. It changes everything, and especially our long-term thinking. And I think I started to question more my place in the world and what am I doing with my life? The stereotypical, quintessential existential crisis, right? Like, why am I here? What am I doing with my life? I'm making, rich people richer. What does that to do of good to the world? And that allied with the fact that I started thinking, look, if we who are probably know, in emerging markets like in Brazil, very few people go to college, and so we have access to information. If we who know that things are going wrong, if we don't do anything about it, who the hell will? Will it be this government? Will it be the NGOs and foundations that work on environmentalism? Like, who is going to fight for the Amazon forest? Like, year in, year out, we hear about the Amazon forest deforestation. Like, ever since I
Right.
I have any sort of conscience, I remember this. So I started thinking, I'm gonna give it a shot. Why not? And I have two buddies, two friends, from the dark side still of finance, who have really great hearts, and they have NGOs for the conservation of jaguars in the middle of Brazil. It's a really cool program that conserves jaguars in the middle of Brazil in a safari style of structure. Just like you have in Kenya or South Africa, in which people on jeeps, they
Yep.
get the animals used to the jeeps, right? And through them, I started saying, look, I want to work for conservation. I want to work with this. Put me in touch with people. So they put me in touch with a lot of people. And long story short, I started talking to people who were involved in conservation projects. Through their conservation project, they certify their work. They issue these sort of security, almost. They're not securities, but they're titles that prove that an area was conserved. Those are called carbon credits, and those are sold to polluting companies basically. And we can definitely go into more detail how that works. But I started talking to them. I thought, wow, this is fascinating. I had no idea this existed, and it seems to be like a solution for all the climate change and devastation that we're witnessing in the world. And then I set up Moss. And Moss, in a nutshell, and we can definitely go into more detail how it works, but the largest carbon credit platform in the world. And it shows you how incipient and how promising the sector is. That a startup that we started last year is already the largest in the world. What it does, or what we do, is we analyze what we consider to be the best and most impactful conservation projects in the Amazon that protect areas of 100 to 150,000 hectares. That's like 400,000 acres. To give you an idea, that's like 2 or 3 times the size of New York City. So
Wow.
gigantic areas that are being
Yeah.
reserved, and we buy wholesale. We buy millions and millions of carbon credits from these guys. We make sure that they are legitimate, and they're doing the right thing. And we add a lot of technology in terms of geo-monitoring and in terms of putting the contracts on blockchain so that they're secure and transparent. And we sell to individuals and companies worldwide.
Yeah. It's such an interesting thing, and I think I
There's a
had
lot there. Look, Grant, we're gonna have a huge challenge here because we can talk for
yeah,
hours,
and I think let's
hours.
let's start at the base level of what exactly
Sure.
is a carbon credit, right? And
Sure.
maybe and maybe and maybe an example, right, from a parallel we could run here, so it helps me understand better. I think better
Of
that
course.
way.
So a carbon credit is a digital certificate that is recognized globally, that follows a certain protocol, that proves that a company or an environmental project avoided the emission of 1 metric ton of CO2 or CO2 equivalent, like methane or nitrogen oxide. It's a mouthful. So it's basically a digital certificate that proves that someone did something to avoid pollution. That's basically it. It's not contract, and there are many sort of myths or misconceptions about how carbon credits work or what they are. And the most common is, carbon credit is, it's a certificate that proves that CO2 was sequestered from the air, that it's a physical thing. It's not a physical thing. Okay, it's an intangible concept. It's the concept of avoiding pollution. So I think as most of us know, clean energy projects like wind farms, solar panels, etc., they issue carbon credits, right? And they sell carbon credits, but they don't take CO2 from the air, right? So that's in the clean energy space, that's where it becomes, the
Yeah.
most obvious. It's not the actual physical sequestration, right? The way it works is, we globally as humankind, and these numbers are going to be, they shouldn't be shocking, but they're still shocking, which is concerning that people don't really know the gravity of, the urgency of what we were going through. But we as humankind, we emit 55 billion tons of CO2 per year. 1 metric ton of CO2 is like a balloon, one of those balloons that people travel on,
Yep.
the size of a house full of gas. We're releasing 55 billion of those balloons per year to the atmosphere. This number 12 years ago, and it's exponentializing, right? It's growing on an exponential basis because 12 years ago, our global pollution or emission of greenhouse gases was 25 billion. And of course, before the Industrial Revolution, it was zero. So it took 300 years to go from zero to 25 billion and 12 years to go from 25 billion to 55. So you see, it's steeping up. If we continue to pollute or emit 55 billion tons of greenhouse gas per year, as we're doing right now, in 50 years, and this is science, this is not an opinion, as maybe some of the populists right, try to globally, not only the US, but try to question and say it's a hoax or whatever. It's not a hoax. Like 97% of world scientists affirm that there is climate change and it is caused by man. So what we are doing is, if we keep doing this, polluting the way we are, in 50 years, by 2070, the world will, with a probability higher than 50%, be the following. This is the following scenario. The world will be like this. The whole tropical area of the world will be uninhabitable, okay? Because it'll be the temperature on a regular day, not even on a hot day, it would be like 150 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. All the world's cities by the shore, by the ocean, will be underwater. And more concerningly, more than half of the world's food production, or the world's food production will fall by more than 50%, which means that the poorest half of the world will die from starvation. When I learned all this by reading this book, The Uninhabitable Earth, which I highly recommend to everyone. Yeah, it's by a journalist, a New York journalist called David Wallace Wells, and he's sort of like me and you, he's a layman who said, let me figure this out, let me
Right.
see what actually is going on, and he talked to the scientists, and I found out that I used to think that Greta was just this annoying teenager, excuse my French, busting everybody's balls about, flying and whatever, driving cars and stuff. And she's not alarmist enough. This is what I found out. Like the situation is really, really critical. And in order to avoid that scenario, and that scenario is like it's right there, right? Like my daughter will be 52 when that happens, right?
Right.
So in order to avoid that, we need to cut the world's pollution by half, by 50% in 5 to 10 years. That's it. Like if
So
we
how
don't
did
do that,
yeah.
it's a given that the scenario will be, the nightmare that I just described.
How does carbon credits help that then? Right?
Yes.
Like
So,
let's
so that's the problem, right? And now I'm going to get to carbon credits. So the solution is by putting a price on pollution, and
Mhm.
the way the world does that is through carbon credits. The world, out of those 55 billion, it mitigates or compensates or offsets. They're all the same thing. 12 billion tons. So 20% of the world's pollution is mitigated somehow via the acquisition or transaction of carbon credits. Out of those 12 billion, 11.9, so almost everything, is in regulated markets. So it means places like California, the East Coast states of the United States, Canadian provinces, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and this year China. So most of the world's, or the world's largest economies are regulated, and it means the government comes and says, look, jurisdiction, a state or a continent in the case of Europe, you guys, you can pollute whatever. Let's pick Europe as an example. You can pollute, let's say you can emit 100 million tons per year, and they divide the economy into sectors, okay? Mining, oil, aviation, whatever. And let's say the airline sector they divide by the number of airlines and they put a target on a per company basis. Let's say 2 million tons per airline. If Lufthansa, let's say, just to give an example,
Yep.
if Lufthansa pollutes or emits 3 million tons, they polluted 1 million above the target. They need to buy 1 million carbon credits because remember, one carbon credit is one avoided ton, right? And let's say if Alitalia or Air France pollutes 1 million less than the target, then they can sell. So you
Mm.
create a double
Mm-hmm.
incentive, right, for the following year in which the guy that polluted too much had a cost, so that guy will try to decrease its cost, right? And the guy who polluted less got a benefit, so that guy will try to increase his benefit. And that has been working for a while now, for more than 10 years. And in Europe, that led to a decrease. These incentives led to a decrease in pollution of 25%, and in California of 15%. Then, Luis, how come the world pollution has increased so much? China and India, right?
Yeah.
More than compensate the reduction in Europe and in some states in the US. So that's how the regulated market works, okay? And that's 99.3% of the global market. And then you have a tiny fraction, which is the most interesting part, and it's where we are focused at Moss, which is called the voluntary market. And it's called voluntary, quote unquote, because it's not
Right.
obligatory by the government, but it's becoming more and more obligatory for companies to buy. They don't buy because they're nice. They're buying because demand, be it from investors, be it from consumers, is requiring them to do so, right? People, when they're buying stuff, they're like, well, is the company that I'm buying this from
Yep.
compensating this pollution in the world, right? So, and that supply, which is of 100 million tons per year, that is coming from environmental projects, okay? And half of that comes from conservation projects like the one I described of vast areas in forests across the globe, Brazil, Africa, Indonesia, etc. 25%, a quarter comes from clean energy projects, and the remaining quarter comes from a myriad of types of projects. And now the issue is, that the world's largest companies like Amazon.com, Microsoft,
Right.
Facebook, etc., they're all buying in the voluntary market. Why? Because since demand is captive or obligatory in the regulated markets, prices are high. So when Microsoft, a company like Microsoft does, when they announce a neutral pledge, this
Yeah.
neutral pledge that we read about on the news, what they're doing is they're calculating how much they're polluting in a year. So let's say they're issuing or emitting 10 million tons per year of pollution or greenhouse gases. They need to buy 10 million carbon credits. And the options available for Microsoft are they can buy a regulated carbon credit from the European market from a Lufthansa that polluted less than the target for $45, or they can buy a regulated carbon credit from a company that polluted less than the target in California, like Apple, or they can buy a carbon credit in the voluntary market in Brazil, let's say, from an Amazon forest conservation project for $7 and say that they are protecting the Amazon and local communities, etc.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which one do you think they buy? Of course, they buy the Amazon forest one, right? It's cheaper and it's better marketing. So the world's flow of demand is flowing thankfully to the voluntary market. That drives up prices, and this is the only commodity in the world where the higher the price, the better for the world, right? Anything else, wheat, corn, oil, you're damaging or reducing the purchasing power of the poorest, right? Whereas with carbon credit, the higher the price, the more people are going to want to conserve forests and do clean energy projects because they'll get more money, right?
I want to just dive into this a little bit just because there's sort of between the regulated market and the voluntary market, it seems like a carbon credit. Is it different in the fact that in the voluntary market, the projects are actually like you can actually see them, right? Like this project will.
It's more tangible, yes.
Correct. Yes. So, but how does the regulated market calculate all the carbon credits if there's not a tangible project associated with it?
Great question. What they can measure in the regulated market, and remember that when we're talking carbon credits, they're almost synonymous, right? I mean, since it's 99% of the total volume, the voluntary part, which is the more intuitive one for us, more tangible, easier to understand,
Yeah.
forest conservation, etc. It's a tiny part. It's less than 1%. And what the government does is they have measured, they can measure for the country as a whole, the country's emissions, and it's easy to measure for an industrial process how much that is emitting of carbon. So you have audit companies that come and let's say you have a widget factory, whatever. You're
Yep.
making shoes. You have a shoe factory.
Yep.
Okay. Making those shoes consumes energy, right?
Yep.
Probably from thermal energy, sorry, from thermal plants that burn coal to generate that energy. Burning coal or burning fossil fuels of any kind
Yep.
emits carbon. So that's the main source of carbon from industrial processes is the burning of fossil fuels to generate energy. So any industrial process, as clean as it may be, even Tesla, in making the electric cars, they
Sure.
use energy that comes from fossil fuels, right? So even the cleanest sort of sector still emits carbon, but that's how they measure it, at a,
But
let's say, at a,
how do they offset it then? Right? Like how do they determine the
it's
offsets for that?
okay. Great point. Great point. And this is when we start getting into more controversial philosophical questions. Like our hunch, our initial reaction, they're not doing anything, right? Yeah, but you're creating incentives for people to pollute less. That's the purpose. Remember that it's not a physical phenomenon that you're certifying here, right? You're not physically certifying the sequestration of carbon, right? You're certifying the avoidance of emissions. So
is that a big difference between the voluntary market though? Because that actually sequesters the carbon?
the only difference in the voluntary market is that the voluntary market is defined by not being obligated by the government. It ended up being coincidentally
Okay.
that governments, that's a great question. And here's the difference. Governments and regulators, they have an easier time, as you can imagine, auditing and measuring how much companies pollute. And these
that seems the easy part, right? It's kind of the measurement. It seems very much the easy part. It's the offsetting.
And it works.
Tangible offsetting is the issue. Feels like.
I wouldn't like to call it tangible offset because the project, let's say the forest, it's also avoiding emissions. It's not taking CO2 out of the air. So the concept is the same. It's just easier for governments to measure, how much companies are polluting, and you have also the fact that these forestry protocols they are controversial. Like some people say that avoiding the emission it's too subjective and that you can't really measure that so well. And governments want to avoid all that discussion, so they don't yet accept the forestry or clean energy protocols in general. It's more of a political issue on what's easier to explain to your constituency.
I think it's a great answer to it. It just seems like why wouldn't they take the same approach as Moss did? I guess why is the tangible a very tiny percent?
Well, let me explain how it's certified because I think it'll become clearer in the voluntary market. Like a clean energy project, let's say a wind farm that has a gigawatt of power, okay, of potential power. If you built a wind farm, of 1 gigawatt, you avoided the construction of a coal plant of 1 gigawatt.
Gotcha.
And let's say what the auditor does is, the auditing company says, look, if there were a coal plant here, it would pollute or emit 1 million per year, 1 million tons per year. So this project, you're going to get awarded, you grant, you own a wind farm, you're going to get allocated 1 million carbon credits per year that you're going to sell to polluting companies like Microsoft.
And the company gets allocated that, correct? For building the wind farm or
exactly right.
Gotcha. So they have so you bank up carbon credits.
Right. You hire like an auditor or certification company. They come in, they do this calculation, and they go to the global registry. There's this watchdog figure of a nonprofit foundation. It's a bunch of nonprofit foundations. There's one that is larger than the others, and it's the main one globally. It's called Vera. And they go to Vera and say, look, this project, Grant's wind farm in whatever, Wyoming, is avoiding the pollution of or emission of 1 million tons per year.
Gotcha.
So Grant in his digital account on this global registry is going to get allocated 1 million carbon credits every year. that it's going to sell, Grant's wind farm is going to sell to, let's say, Shell or Chevron or whatever.
Yep.
For them to buy, cancel those credits. They'll send you money. You'll send them carbon credits. They'll cancel those, retire those, and then they'll get a certificate that will allow them to claim that they mitigated, X amount of pollution per year. Now, that's how it works for the clean energy projects. For the forestry projects, it's a bit more, intangible, and it requires more of our imagination because it's a little more intangible. But forests are big carbon reservoirs.
Yeah.
Okay, half a tree is made of carbon atoms. If you recall from high school chemistry, trees are made of cellulose, and a cellulose molecule is C6H12O6. So when you burn or slash a tree or any sort of plant, that those carbon atoms, that molecule breaks and it forms CO, which is carbon monoxide, CO2, carbon dioxide, and methane, CH4. So what you want to do with a huge forest, when it gets slashed and burned, not only do you lose, that the whole, environment for animals, for other trees and stuff like that, but not only does it impact the whole balance of the biosphere, but it also emits carbon because when the tree dies or when it gets burned, that's being carbon is being released to the atmosphere.
Gotcha.
Now, in Brazil's case, for example, it's extreme. Brazil, out of the 55 billion tons of global pollution or emissions, Brazil emits 2 billion, and out of Brazil's 2 billion, 1.5 comes from deforestation. So 75% comes from us, Brazilians slashing and burning our forests. If you take an area of 100,000 hectares, it usually has 1,000 tons of biomass per hectare. So and half of that is carbon. So 100,000 hectare forest will have 100 million tons of biomass, and it'll be like a 50 million ton CO2 reservoir.
Real quick.
Yeah, sorry,
so you could get carbon credits for not destroying something or preserving something.
Exactly.
Okay.
It's for avoiding the
Get
destruction.
it.
Just like a company that polluted less than a target avoided the pollution of, let's say, right in my airline example, it's the same concept. It's avoiding pollution, right? But as you can see, imagine the complexity of proving that a forest avoided the deforestation or whatever.
Correct. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
You got to have satellite images. You got to have all sorts of studies. You got to have drone imaging. You got to go there and interview local communities.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are all sorts of, it's highly complex, expensive, and very presential physical work. And governments, like, imagine the regulator in California, they don't want to get their fingers dirty with or tangled in this, philosophical discussions. Well, and there are all sorts of subjective discussions on the forest conservation carbon issues. For example, there's a concept of leakage, which is some critics of carbon credits or offsetting on forestry projects. They say you're just shifting the deforestation. If you protect an area, the deforestation from that area just goes to the neighboring area. So you're not, really doing anything. It's like you're trying to dry, ice with towels or whatever.
Well, you can save one area, but you destroy another, right? Like it's
right.
A little bit chicken and egg.
So that's one of the issues, and in the studies or the analysis for carbon credit certification in forestry projects it ends up being highly complex because exactly this sort of issue, like you can't just monitor that specific area. You got to monitor the whole. You got to have a more wholesale approach, a macro approach to see the behavior of the whole area.
Yeah, and because
it's a lot of information, I know.
No, it's great. No, I mean it's great conversation.
The argument, for example, Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation and Elon Musk, and I think Richard Branson as well, are giving a lot of research grants and investing a lot in CO2 sequestration machines or CO2 capture machines. And those have an implicit cost of $500 to $1,000 per ton of CO2. The Amazon forest carbon credit, as I mentioned, you can buy wholesale at $7 or $8. So, the quick and dirty way that we can reach that target of reducing the world's pollution by 50% so we avoid, doomsday or Armageddon in 2070, it has to go through carbon credits. The capture machines are not going to become cheap fast enough for us to
Mm,
save the world. That's the
gotcha.
point.
Is there evidence that this is working to some sort of degree? Like, what does the analysis say
Yeah.
thus far?
Yes. Yes. Like I mentioned, emissions in Europe, using this system
Yep.
fell by 25% in 10 years. So it works.
Yep.
In California, the emissions dropped by 15%, 1.5, in spite of a growing economy. Okay, so
Right. Right.
the argument that it's either growth or pollution doesn't work.
Yep.
It's simply not true that the economy doesn't exist.
And so what Moss does, it provides a platform to you as an individual or business to buy carbon credits, store them in a digital wallet, and then you can also sell the credits
Exactly.
on Moss, correct? Is that sort of in a nutshell what Moss provides? And then we'll get into the
Yeah.
token part because the token part is super interesting as well.
Yeah, we are a carbon credit retailer. Our model is not much different from Amazon.com in the beginning, and our vision is to be, no pun intended, the environmental Amazon.com, in the future. Amazon.com began buying books wholesale, and they bought in gigantic volumes, and they got a discount, and selling retail, and with the novelty or the innovation of being digital, right? Or online. Replace books for carbon credits and online for blockchain, and you got Moss.
Mm-hmm.
We do the exact same thing. We
We
buy
should have just
carbon
started
credits.
there. We should have just started there. That was so easy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Very well explained.
And like Amazon.com, and this is our vision, of course, our target is Amazon.com said, wow, I'm making a lot of money doing this with books. Maybe I can do this with CDs, DVDs, electronics. And they started increasing, the number of items and types of products they sold. And eventually they were selling so much stuff that, retailers, sellers of widgets, of things, were willing to pay Amazon to sell stuff on their platform. And buyers were also willing to pay a subscription to Amazon, which became Amazon Prime, to get access to, their gigantic menu of things to buy. That's how we envision Moss, or that's how we intend Moss to develop in the future. I mean, we're like Amazon.com in 99.
Carbon credits are the books. So that's sort of the first step in all this. Eventually, there'll be carbon credits and other forms of
organic products from the forest. There are all sorts of other environmental assets, biodiversity credits, for example, that work in the same sort of structure or concept.
We need ocean credits. We need to save our.
There are ocean credits.
Great.
There are ocean credits.
Amazing.
They're called. It's called blue carbon. It's really cool.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Blue carbon is ocean carbon credits. And it is a challenge because it is the most challenging one to measure, of course.
Yeah.
Oceans are moving things. It's hard to measure the avoidance of pollution and all that. But it's really important for beaches, Everglades, that sort of environment, to protect that. You do it through blue carbon.
And the idea of Moss, let's get to maybe the token part as well, if we could chat about that for a little bit. So MCO2 is the Moss token, which can be traded as an asset, correct, on cryptocurrency exchanges?
Crypto exchanges, yes.
Yes, yeah. So that then gets more people involved because it becomes a tradable asset.
That's it.
The idea is to get obviously many more people buying and selling these things, and that makes it more valuable, and more people in turn use them at scale.
Carbon credits are fascinating because carbon credits were the first global digital commodity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Until carbon credits showed up, you only had physical commodities like oil, and a commodity being, a standardized contract that is defined the same way the world over.
Yep.
So, a barrel of oil, a bag of sugar, whatever. And carbon credits were created. They were the world's first digital asset. They were created a decade or more than a decade before Bitcoin in 2009. And yet, paradoxically, it's the only commodity that it still trades analogically. Like people, when Apple wants to buy a carbon credit, it doesn't go to an electronic system, although it is an electronic asset. It picks up the phone and calls a broker in Europe, that calls a broker in Brazil, that
Interesting.
calls a broker in the middle of the forest, that calls the forest project, and then they call each other back. And they do this back and forth, and then the Apple sustainability analyst goes presentially, physically to the forest to check it out and whatnot. So one transaction takes like
Wow.
more than a year.
Wow.
It's highly inefficient.
Yeah.
When I looked at this, I said, really? Like we're in 2021 or at the time 2019, and people are still trading carbon credits on the phone? Like this makes absolutely no
Unbelievable.
sense.
Right.
Unbelievable, right? And there's no transparency. Of course, when people are trading things on the phone, you don't know. There's no transparency on price, on volumes. Like nobody knows what's. If you ask, if until we showed up and we standardized carbon credits via the MCO2 token,
Yep.
you can now go on the screen, and I can send you a bunch of sites that have the price link, and you can see a carbon credit is worth $17.
Hmm.
That's the Moss carbon credit. Until then, if you ask Apple what's the price of carbon, they'll tell you $5. And if you ask BP, they'll tell you 15. And prices were all over the place, and nobody knew
Yep.
the actual price because those transactions they're secret. They are
Mm.
non-public. They're private. So that's what really caught my attention, that it was still trading analogically, the inefficiency of it all.
Yeah.
And more importantly, when I started studying the demand and supply, I gave you all the supply figures.
Yep.
And as I said, there's an interesting point on demand. Demand is skyrocketing, and it's not coincidental that all of the major companies of the world started announcing neutral pledges 2 years ago.
Yep.
What happened 2 years ago, Grant? That very few people talk about it. It's not a rhetorical question. But what demographically happened 2 years ago that nobody talks about? Something happened 2 years ago that very few people talk about, but it had massive implications in the world, especially in the world of carbon credits. Millennials became the world's most important demographic group.
Yep. There you
They
go.
surpassed baby
Yes.
boomers.
Yes. Yes.
So forever, I've always heard baby boomers are the most important demographic group. That shifted 2 years ago.
Hmm.
Millennials are now 30%. Millennials being, people from 20 to 40. Millennials are now 30% of the world's population, 50% of the world's workforce, and in 5 years, there'll be 70% of the world's workforce, which means that, the world's most populous or, most important demographic group, they have totally different values. I mean, example, it's not a coincidence that sustainable investment or ESG funds flows in 2018 were 100 million, last year were 15 billion, and this year will be 50. Why? Because millennials are investing, instead of our parents or grandparents,
Yep.
and millennials are consuming. So for when you buy whatever detergent, for you it's a lot more important for that detergent not to be polluted than it was for your parents,
Hmm.
and that changes everything.
Yeah.
So companies, they're not compensating because they want to. Unilever announced a global pledge to make carbon neutral products, all their products carbon neutral by 2025. Are
Hmm.
they doing this because they're nice? Because they're tree huggers? No, they're doing it because it's a business decision.
Yes.
And they're preparing for a world in which this will be important for demand, and they'll sell more if they have carbon neutral detergent. And this is, of course, because of that choice that I said companies have, that Microsoft is faced with. Remember the
Yep.
$45 carbon
Yep.
credit in Europe versus the $7 one in the Amazon. All that demand, marginal demand is flowing to carbon credits in the Amazon. When I looked at that, or in the voluntary market globally, when I looked at that, I said, oh my God, the price of this thing is going to rip. I mean, it's really going to rip because, for example, demand supply is, since it's so complicated to add, supply, because it's so complicated to certify the projects and everything. Supply is relatively stable for the next years, but demand this year, 2 years ago it was 100 million demand, 100 million supply. This year we're talking about 100 million supply and probably 1 billion of demand. So prices,
Yep.
are taking off. So this is why we focus on the voluntary market. This is also why I started looking into buying carbon credits as an asset to carry. And then what I found out, and this is where the idea for Moss came from, there was no place for me to buy carbon credits. You can buy
Mhm.
carbon credits as an expense, as you can go on websites in which you say, have you ever compensated your carbon footprint?
Yeah, so I do it through a system. It's called the Vera initiative. As an individual or a person, you could pay like $6 a month, and then that in turns
Yep.
through the software, it shows you how much you can offset. It's really interesting. You would love it.
You're like the second person out of maybe 5,000 people that I have asked this question that has compensated your carbon footprint. So congratulations for that. The point I'm going to make is when I was trying to buy carbon credits,
Yes.
I thought I saw this model that you described, and I said, this is a donation. I want to donate, but
Very
I
much.
don't want to just donate.
Yep.
I also want to buy the asset. I want, for people
Brilliant.
like, right? And I also saw that transaction and I thought, look, I'm getting an email or a PDF or whatever. What guarantees me that this guy is legit? Like, it could be a scam. It could be someone that just created some sort of website. Like, that this is, legitimate and stuff, but it might just as well, be like a Ponzi scheme or whatever. So I thought, if I put this on blockchain and people can trace it way back to the original, the project that was originating this thing, like for example, taking plastics out of the ocean and the kind of stuff and generating jobs and whatnot. And I price it below, the existing sites, and I give the person the asset, like the actual token. For example, if you had known of Moss and you
Yes.
said the same $72,
Yep.
but we give you an asset, we price it instead of
Brilliant.
72 at $50, and we put it on blockchain. Like,
Yep.
why the hell are you going to do it with the other one? So
Mhm.
that's how the idea for Moss came about. This is why we put it on blockchain to give it transparency and security.
The asset, the tokenizing of it is absolutely, I think, the way to go. I think that's how you scale it. That's how you get more people involved.
That's it.
When you can buy and sell an asset that it's interesting because the asset does something, right? Which
Exactly.
is a bit different as well.
Yeah,
Um,
there's like a purpose to it.
yeah.
Like besides an economic purpose, there's additional purpose to it.
So I want to try to wrap up, even though I still have so many questions. I guess one would be, are you optimistic? I guess going back to China and India, right? It's like, I guess it's hard for whether it's Europe or the United States to tell them to not grow at the same pace and scale like we did, right? If you grow like the US and the UK and in Europe and you have 5x the amount of people, then yes, that's a lot of damage that the earth is going to go through. But there's also a lot of people living in extreme poverty in those areas, right? So it's like, how can the world tell them they can't get out of that, but the developed world has, right? And look, I'm sort of with you. I think technology and there's a lot of systems out there where they can scale better than Europe and America did, hundreds of years ago. I guess what are you sort of optimistic about? And do you think we have it in us as a human species to kind of get this done?
Great question and great point. That's the main argument that politicians in emerging markets have against implementing this, but it's a false argument because it's based on the false premise that you have to choose between growth and the environment, and you do not. As I said, Europe,
You're totally right now. I think it can be done that way.
it can definitely be done, and Europe and California have shown, the economies, GDP in those places doubled and pollution dropped. So it can be done. The second point is that the millennial generation, between the environment and growth, they choose environment. And I think in 20 years, our kids, like my daughter, she's now 2. So when she's 22, I have this hunch, and it's great that this is being recorded so that, in 20 years we can look back, and I'm pretty confident she's going to look back and say, Dad, what the hell were you guys thinking? Burning oil to run your cars? I mean, what were you thinking? Sort of like we sort of criticize our grandparents for smoking on planes and stuff like that. But
100%.
so
100%.
it's a,
Also,
it's a
I feel
structural.
like they treat me like animals too. Like they're gonna look back and say, "Man, you guys really treat the animals like shit."
Exactly.
That's gonna be another one. I feel like in 50.
Yeah, that's another one too. So it's a changing, a structural changing happening in culture for the world. And I think the third important point to be made here, that makes me optimistic, it has become a geopolitical trophy to be a green economy. Like the
Yep.
Chinese are super smart.
Yeah.
It's a millennial culture. I mean, it's been around for millennia. They know that it's a gigantic population, and the only way the regime can self that they can stay in power is via tapping or into the demands of the population. And the population in China has been demanding a decrease in pollution for many years now. There were riots and revolts in 2013 and 14 because pollution was just too high. It gets to a point where people are like, well, I'm going to die anyway, so
Yep.
what the hell? I'm going to rebel, and if the government kills me, so be it, right? Pollution got to the point where people have nothing to lose, they start rebelling.
Right.
And that's the greatest concern, of course, for a more autocratic regime like China. And China is really the most important piece in this chessboard because they're responsible for 1/3 of the world's pollution. So, and there is a guideline for the government for many years now for China to decrease its pollution and to become the world's green power. So there is like we had as humankind a nuclear race between the US and the Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s. Now there's a green race between China, Europe, and the US.
How
It's no
different is
coincidence
that,
that Biden,
huh? How different and
yeah, it's weird.
cool is that?
It's a cool race. Yeah, of course. But being green generates jobs.
Yep. That's the
For
other
example,
factor. Yep. That's the other big factor.
yeah, for example, China makes 95% of the world's electric scooters and electric buses. That's geopolitically, of course, an advantage that China already has over the US. I'm pretty sure the Biden administration is not comfortable with that. That it's already behind China and Europe in a lot of green industrial sectors. So I am very optimistic because I think politically, demographically, culturally, the world is aligning. This, that solving the world's pollution is the most important thing out there. It's becoming a consensus. It's no longer, let's talk economics, employment, health, and then environment. It's let's talk environment and then the rest.
Because it affects everything else, right? I mean, that's the
It affects
domino.
everything else, right? I
That's the
mean,
domino that falls that affects it all.
if we keep destroying the planet, we're not going to exist. So, who the hell cares about poverty, health, etc.? We're not going to be around.
Well, thank you so much, Luis. This was amazing, and thank you for educating me and helping me understand these complex issues, right? I mean, I think we're still in such the beginning stages of all this that I can't wait to see what innovations come out of this. And obviously, I think transparency gets better, as more people get into this world and understand it and kind of buy once people buy assets, right, and buy carbon credits, I think they will start to educate themselves more, and so will businesses. So at scale, I think it gets more people talking about it, thinking about it. But I think that's the power in tokenizing something. When you become an asset, I think people like to learn more about it. I mean, obviously, with the crypto boom, right? I mean, I think more and more people are just learning about it, understanding it. Once you understand it, you'd like to purchase it, and then you can trade it or save it or do whatever else you want with it. So, I say all that to say, best of luck on building a really complex system. But we
Thank you,
need
sir.
people and teams like you to take it on, right? So keep grinding, my man.
Thank you, sir. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. a lot of the work I think is about having conversations like this and spreading the gospel, so to speak. It's an awareness issue. Like when people know that this exists, they
Yeah.
adopt it because it's such a cool concept. It's hard to grasp, but once people grasp it, the acceptance is very high. So and once we get past that hurdle of getting people to know about it, then I think there's definitely high